Go ahead, make your statement.
All right, so my name is Brewer. I am a Carbondale resident. I studied at SIU. I'm currently teaching at a nearby community college. One of the supporters for the Community Bill of Rights project. I wanted to speak directly and honestly and from the heart today. So we know that many of you wanted to hear back from Michael Carr, the state's attorney, who offered his legal opinion on the Community Bill of Rights. Many of us have also seen the letter from the state's attorney, and that's in part what I wanted to comment on here today. The state's attorney's office has told you that Jackson County cannot adopt the proposed ordinance because state legislation has not granted Jackson County the authority to enact such measures, and also because our ordinance is preempted by state and federal law. Now, it may sound odd, but unfortunately, the state attorney's letter, the state attorney's legal position has precious little to do with the actual Community Bill of Rights. That is, his position fails to even acknowledge the fundamental issue that we are raising, right? The reason that all of us keep showing up to these meetings. And now, whether for or against any serious position on our Community Bill of Rights cannot dodge the fundamental issue that we are laying in front of you, right? So what's that issue? Namely, it's that there is a profound moral difference and a profound legal difference between state-granted municipal authority on the one hand and an inalienable right to self-government on the other. Our Community Bill of Rights exercises the latter. We are not pretending to work within the frameworks of existing municipal authority. Our Community Bill of Rights has been very explicit about this. Our comments have been very explicit about this. We're not fractivists trying to pass a ban. It's not that simple. It's just not. Because we are dealing with a civil rights issue. We are here because we are challenging an unjust and undemocratic legal framework that has failed to recognize our community's fundamental civil right to reject corporate industrial harm. So you can understand if there might be at times a little bit of frustration because we read the state's attorney's letter as just the latest iteration of what at times feels like a persistent and deliberate refusal to acknowledge the very terms of the discussion. None of this was a surprise to us when we read the state's attorney's letter. We sort of collectively exhaled the same sigh of frustration. Because we agree, under the existing legal structure, Jackson County has not been granted the authority to pass such an ordinance. But again, there is a fundamental difference between the authority to legislate, which can be given and taken away by the state, and the right to govern, which is self-asserting and inherent. Our Community Bill of Rights upholds the latter. In our basic right to self-government, our rights to a healthy environment, these exist prior to any authority that the state may or may not have delegated to our local representatives. So as just an example of this distinction that is fundamental to this discussion, simply because a black man living as a second-class citizen under Jim Crow was not granted the legal permission to cast a vote did not mean that he did not have the right to vote. Rather, an oppressive government failed to recognize his basic human rights, much like an oppressive government failed to recognize the rights of women suffragists 40 years earlier. The Jim Crow South, as well as the pre-19th Amendment United States, were situations in which illegitimate structures of government and illegitimate laws had rendered democracy impossible for huge numbers of people. Right? And so the question is, how did the activists get the right to vote? How did they win it? Well, on the basis of their inherent civil rights, these Americans had to willfully disobey those existing structures of authority which had mandated what they were allowed and what they were not allowed to do. Right? No one has ever voted for the right to vote. No one has ever won freedom from oppressive and illegitimate legal structures without challenging those illegitimate legal structures. So today, communities like ours, communities like Jackson County, will never get free from corporate harm by working wholly within the existing legal framework, precisely because it is that existing legal framework that has disempowered the political will of whole communities in the first place. Because it is precisely that existing legal framework which has, over time, dramatically, in an unprecedented fashion, elevated the legal and civic privileges of private corporations. Right? Our rights are inalienable. They exist prior to state laws, and they exist prior to the current legal doctrines like Dillon's Rule and state preemption that the state's attorney references. Right? This is where we want you to meet us in the conversation. It's about rights. It's not about legislative authority that can be given and taken away by the state legislature. So we urge you, our county board, to join us to help us once again drive these basic civil principles back into law. Just as Article 1 of our Illinois State Constitution obliges, it says, quote, "A frequent recurrence to the fundamental principles of civil government is necessary to preserve the blessings of liberty." Now, we never expected the state's attorney to genuinely participate in our discussion and engage in these fundamental principles of civil government, right? He works for the state. His duty, his legal obligation, is to the state and to its current legal structure. Your duty, however, your legal obligation is to us, right? The people of Jackson County, whose rights you swore to protect, whose consent renders your authority legitimate. Now, the state's attorney, along with some of the county board members, have also called into question our description of the current system of government as illegitimate. And so, we want to comment on that. What I can say is that along with the heroes of the civil rights movement, along with the suffragists and the labor organizers of the early 20th century, along with the courageous LGBT rights activists, and along with the brave young men and women who are right now in the streets fighting against structural racism and mass incarceration, and along with the very first American revolutionaries, along with them, we also maintain that legal and political structures are rendered illegitimate insofar as they violate the consent of the governed and prevent people from actualizing their basic fundamental human rights. And so when the question is whether or not our current structure of law does that, we maintain that it most definitely does. We maintain that legal principles at both the state and federal level has formed a box that traps communities into a political straitjacket, overturning their local laws, undermining their civic will, while silencing their dissent in the name of representation. And at the same time, this is the legal structure that has granted more constitutional privileges to large billion-dollar corporations. We, the people in Jackson County, have the inalienable right to break free from that box and join the close to 200 other communities that have stood up against this illegitimate legal structure and passed community bills of rights. Yes, our current government is illegitimate insofar as it has rendered our county board unable to protect our rights. But we can change this. It means renewing the truly democratic spirit that recognizes that legitimacy is derived from the consent of the governed. Now, because the board's authority to protect our rights, insofar as it is a legitimate authority, does not derive from the state's attorney. This board's authority does not derive from the state's legislature. Rather, this board is empowered to protect our rights because your legitimate authority, as well as the legitimate authority of the state legislature, is derived only from the consent of the governed. Right, this is not a radical posture, but I'm saying nothing other than what has been made explicit in our very own state constitution, which, by the way, also derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Now, we cannot be more direct with you, our representatives, so please add this to the minutes today from the meeting and imprint this on your minds. We do not consent to be fracked. We do not consent to a spread of dangerous fracking infrastructure, not in our county, not where we live, not where our friends live, not where our families live, not where our children live and will live. We do not consent to legal mechanisms, to structures of law that allow a public entity like the state legislature to impose upon us the activities of harmful, accident-prone, carcinage-independent industrial activities. We do not consent to structures of law that allow private entities like big oil corporations to come into our community against our will and engage in activities that will inevitably violate our rights to a healthful environment. We do not consent to structures of law that allow corporations, which are nothing more than property, to draw on more federal constitutional privileges than living human beings and their communities. We do not consent to illegitimate legal doctrines like state preemption and Dillon's rule that allows state legislation to steamroll over the political will of whole communities and overturn their local environmental laws, which they do consistently. We do not consent to illegitimate legal doctrines that treat nature exclusively as the legal property of its owner, who can then, in turn, entirely consume, destroy, and pollute that nature for the sake of profit. And we do not consent to the undemocratic legal principles, both at the state and federal level, which do not recognize a community's right to reject corporate industrial harm. Our local ordinance, our community bill of rights, is nothing other. We have the inherent right to challenge, to change, and to work outside of unjust legal frameworks. And our community bill of rights, our ordinance, is nothing other than how we can do that, how we can enforce our fundamental civil rights. Whether or not the state's attorney, whether or not the state of Illinois, whether or not the federal government recognizes our right to do this, to pass such an ordinance, we have that right nonetheless. But luckily, the Illinois State Constitution recognizes all this, and in fact, the Illinois State Constitution obligates us to directly enforce our civil rights when they're necessary. So I quote now from the State of Illinois Constitution, Article 11, Section 2. Each person has the right to a healthful environment. Each person may enforce that right against any party, public or private. Public or private. Article 11, Section 2 ain't talking about voting for better politicians. Article 11, Section 2 ain't talking about negotiating with IDNR officials. Right? Because those types of civic action fundamentally rely on others, namely politicians, to enforce our civil rights for us. No. Article 11, Section 2 recognizes our right to enforce our rights ourselves, even against the state legislature, a public entity, if necessary. It's almost finished. Now, the state's attorney has also described the Hydraulic Fracturing Regulatory Act as a, quote, comprehensive piece of legislation. And he suggests that it will safeguard our health by fining corporations and regulatory monitoring them. But we can only reiterate, regulations don't prevent harm. In fact, they do just the opposite. Regulations codify harm. Southern Illinoisans have been saying for the past 3 years that we don't want to regulate fracking, we want to prevent it. We don't want to wait around for a gas explosion, or an oil spill, or a distribution accident, or for God's sake, an earthquake. We want this prevented. Many of us, we've worked with regulations, we've worked with IDNR, we've worked with the permitting process, and no matter what, we always get harmed. Right? There is this fundamental hopelessness that's involved in working with the permitting process. Right? Petitions, injunctions, symbolic moratoriums, call your representative, marathons, they never deliver. What we've learned about working within the framework of regulation, what will happen if we try to work within the Hydraulic Fracturing Regulatory Act? What we've learned is that these regulatory agencies are not primarily about the business of regulating industry. They are primarily about regulating citizen action by channeling it into these broken, or rather fixed, regulatory systems where we can never win. So do you know what we, the people, have discovered over the past 4 years? We ain't got a fracking problem. We got a democracy problem. So in closing, we want to say this. These decisions about whether or not Jackson County gets fracked or loaded down with fracking infrastructure, we want you to see, along with us, that it is fundamentally not just for these decisions to be made by a few faraway corporations and a few faraway legislators who live at the distance from the consequences of those decisions. Decisions about whether or not Jackson County gets fracked should be made by the people and the communities who face the consequences of Jackson County being fracked. This isn't a political game for us, right? We're not being manipulated by some outside group. We live here. We are rooted here. We are fighting for our lives here and for our civil rights here. And we're simply not going to let their fracking wells and their fracking infrastructure sweep across our communities. But it's going to be much, much easier if all of you work with us on that. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Can you submit those comments so we can put it with the minutes, because we don't typically write them verbatim?
I can. I also have what another member gave to me is just a recent survey about local Jackson County residents and their fracking. Pass these out.
Absolutely. Pass them out. Does any other citizen wish to make a comment about fracking or roller skating or anything? Go ahead.
I'd just like to thank you all for respectfully listening tonight. The last time you were here, I felt totally disrespected by the whole process, and I want to thank you for your your change of mind. Hopefully you'll really listen and work with us this time.
Okay, does anyone else wish to make a comment to the board?
We'll move on.